Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
It's all yours, sir. We can see your slideshow mode, so you can proceed with your presentation now.
Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to welcome you to this MILE Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship webinar. As you've heard from Ali Jaffrey, my name is Dr. Andrew Brough. I'm talking today from Johannesburg in South Africa on how leaders develop cultural intelligence. I've had a particular interest in this subject for more than 20 years, working with global companies, helping them to partner across culture, and there's no doubt that as companies expand into ever far reaches of the globe, that they will find themselves having to embrace the challenges and the complexities of working globally. So in this 40-minute presentation, I want to talk about some of the things that pertain to how leaders develop their cultural intelligence, or as it's sometimes referred to, CQ, and I've just put a short agenda together so that you can follow me as I go through this content. I want to begin by just setting a scene in terms of our changing world and why it is so important for leaders who are serious about taking their followers into the 21st century to understand the dynamics and the complexities of the changing environment. The second thing we're going to talk about then is culture. What is it? Why is it so complex? How do we understand it? And what does it mean for us as leaders in the global context? And then thirdly, we're going to talk about some very practical skills to develop your cultural intelligence as a leader. The fourth thing I want to do is to introduce you to one of many tools that are available, but in particular the tool that we like to use called the Country Navigator, which is based on about 20 years of research and country mapping. And then we'll take questions at the end and then wrap up the session. So I know that if you have questions, you can just post those to Ali in the chat box, and he'll make sure that we get those later. So let's first of all think about why we need cultural intelligence. There's no doubt, if we think about the drivers, both in the local and in the international environment, then we can see that the world is changing. How is the world changing? Well, we know that there's significant globalization. Companies are looking to break into new territories. They're finding markets where they were not before, and with that comes a new host of customers who may come from very, very different cultural backgrounds. I think the second thing that's important is recognizing that if you're going to remain competitive, then globalization comes with that, and with that comes the complexity of having to try and get into new cultural markets. The third thing then is recognizing that part of your competitive advantage is going to be tied to your ability to innovate, to solve problems, and to generate intellectual capital that is culturally specific and addresses particular needs within a particular geography in the world. And then fourthly, from an internal perspective, recognizing that if you're going to attract the best talent, if you're going to retain the best talent, that you're going to need a diverse workforce, not just who can speak more than one language possibly, but you have some international experience, and that if you're going to inspire and retain those kinds of individuals, often they're high performing, then you're going to need to embrace the principles of cultural intelligence in your workforce. And of course, cross-border collaboration. Many of my customers and clients are people that are located in other parts of the world, and so I now have to learn to adapt my working style, my expectations, my communication, and my ability to work in a team through developing my cultural intelligence. Now, there are many other drivers, but I think what this does is it sets the scene for us to think about a cultural lens. And it has been said that all of us come to the world of work, to our world of organization with a particular world view, and that we do not see the world as it is, but rather as we are. So there's no doubt that we will be influenced by our cultural lens, if you like, in how we see the world, and very often we can make snap judgments, inappropriate judgments, incorrect judgments, because of our inability to understand what is going on. And so a global leader, a culturally sensitive leader, is one who learns to see the world through this cultural lens and to recognize that things are not always as they seem. And this, of course, is complex. And so the second thing that I want to talk about today is the complexity of culture. Now, without being too academic about this, maybe we just need to define a couple of things. There are literally hundreds of definitions of this thing that we call culture. But the definition that we like to use is that it's a shared pattern of preferred values, beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, and behaviors that define the way of life of a particular group. Now, sometimes if we think about culture at the organizational level or at the company level, it might be defined as the personality of the group or the group's operating system, or this one I particularly like, the collective software of the mind. Put simply, the way we do things around here. And of course this works not just at the national level or the geographical level, but we know that even within companies you're going to find a particular culture, and then even within a particular company you might find that different departments or divisions have particular cultures. So we're using this word culture broadly here, but I think it's important to point out that although the strong emphasis of this presentation is on this idea of global cultural intelligence, that culture expands beyond that. And it's complex because it's different. And if I show you some of those cultural differences, this reinforces the point that I was making earlier. From the business unit culture to a national culture or organizational culture, or even a team culture or regional culture, you can see that if you're going to be culturally intelligent, it's going to be important to recognize that this is complex, that it is difficult, and that you need to develop your insights to understand what is happening in the world around you. So that's culture. But one of the best examples to explain this, I think, is a model that's been used for many, many years, and I thought that I would share it with you. We call it the cultural iceberg. And if you know anything about icebergs, then typically what you see at the top is not always representative of what is underneath the surface. And so if we think about culture, whether you may be traveling into a culture that's rich in architecture and art and famous for its literature and its cuisine, those might be the things that you would see at the quote-unquote top of the iceberg, if you like. But it's only that when you begin to understand the belief system and the values and the assumptions and the attitudes and the expectations that drive those particular things that you really start to develop your cultural intelligence. This could have to do with things ranging from social greetings to how meetings are conducted to how commercial transactions are concluded. And it's unfortunate that very often we send our leaders into global environments where they are not equipped with how to recognize what is going on below the surface, and so very often they end up looking at just what they see above surface without any deeper understanding of what is going on above the surface. And there are many examples of that, and I wish I had more time to talk that through with you, but I think it's important just to recognize that the culturally intelligent leader is able to make the distinction between what you don't see and what you do see. I now want to get you to think about cultural challenges. And one of the dangers that we have in any cultural intelligence work is, first of all, that we run the risk of talking about a particular culture, an American culture or a British culture or a South African culture. And I think that's quite dangerous because we never sell to or work with or negotiate with a culture. In fact, what will happen is that we sell to or work with and negotiate with individuals who have been socialized into a culture or even several cultures. So it's very dangerous to fall into the trap of negative stereotyping, and you often hear that when people start using the all descriptor. You know, all women, all Spanish, all males, all IT people. This is very, very dangerous, and it shows that people are unsophisticated in their cultural intelligence, because ultimately what we do know is that if you're going to develop your cultural intelligence, you have to recognize that you're working with individuals within that context. So let's go back to some of our tools. What do we mean by cultural intelligence? Again, this has been defined by many different thought leaders. It has been defined in one place as the ability or the capability to function effectively in a variety of cultural contexts. The definition I've given here is that it's the ability to work collaboratively with people from different backgrounds and cultures. And how do you apply cultural intelligence? Well, what you do first of all is you look at the significant background facts that led to this particular instance. What is going on here? Why am I being presented food in this particular way? Why are these people building their houses in the way that they do? Why are these people dressing in the way that they appear to? And when you have the facts, you can then understand the mindset or the attitude behind that action. And that's really, really important, that you don't just look at the background facts at face value, but if you're going to be culturally intelligent, then you want to understand mindset, and that's really, really important. And then the third thing is to understand that this is reflected in behaviors. So what do we see happening? So when I'm presented with some cuisine that may be different to what I'm used to, when I'm in a meeting where the presentation is conducted quite differently to how I might do it, when the reasoning or the thinking process reflects something very different to my educational background, it's important to use this ladder of cultural intelligence all the time, to see what is happening, to understand the attitudes that are driving those behaviors, and then to make sure that you have your facts straight. And the more that we do that, and the more that we work up and down that ladder of cultural intelligence, I think the more astute we become. So it's the ability to suspend judgment. It's the ability to not cast aspersions on what you see, but to recognize that whether you're thinking about ethnic culture or generational culture or organizational culture, that you are seeking to understand. And that brings me to a very important slide. If we're going to develop our cultural intelligence, then we have to avoid the stereotypes that you see on the left-hand side. This fixed view of the world, where we are closed to information on individual variations. This comes back to that all-type descriptor that I spoke about earlier. But what we rather want to do is discuss tendencies. So on the right-hand side, you see an open circle in the green there. It's modifiable. And what that says is, in this particular context, the tendency will be for people to present in this way, or to reason in this way, or to relate in this way. But I'm open to new information, and I'm open to the individual variations that come with that, because I recognize that I can only talk about tendencies rather than expecting everybody within that particular cultural framework to behave in a particular way. And that's a fundamental point of departure in any cultural intelligence work that we might do. So the tool that I want to share with you today in terms of developing cultural intelligence comes from my colleagues based in London, a research team called TMA World, and they, using this idea of the cultural lens, talk about the fact that in any cultural engagement there are these three dynamics. The dynamic of how we relate to each other, the dynamic of how we regulate or manage our time, and the dynamic of how we think. This is a whole day workshop, so I'm only going to give you a high-level summary here. But if you think about these as continuums, each of these cultural orientations shows that a particular cultural group will have a tendency. So if you look in the red block, you might find that an individual is more task-focused versus more relationship-focused. In certain cultures, you will find that their communication is far more explicit versus implicit. You might find that in certain cultures there's a very strong focus on the individual, on the I, versus other cultures that are much more collective. Now those differences right there between task and relationship, explicit or implicit communication, and the individual versus the group identity are going to be fundamentally important for how you relate to people who may be different. And I'll show you that continuum in just a moment. If we think about regulating, we know that certain cultures are far more risk averse. They want to avoid taking risk. They want to avoid the unpredictable. There are other cultures that love risk. They're willing to take any chance at any opportunity and be happy to live with the consequences. One of the very obvious differences that we see culturally, and we're talking now about ethnic and national cultures, would be the use of time. So certain cultures pride themselves on their punctuality, on the fact that a 5 o'clock meeting starts at 5 o'clock, that a 2 o'clock train leaves the station at 2 o'clock and not 2:01, or maybe, as in some cases, many hours later, or maybe not at all. And so you find this continuum of, on the left-hand side, cultures that are very time-bound, because time is seen as linear, and on the right-hand side, cultures that have a much looser perspective on time. Time is circular, and if I don't get it right this time, quote unquote, then time will come again. If we think about power, we see that in certain cultures there is this desire to have a much flatter structure, a much more consensual decision-making process, a much more shared input process to how decisions are made. And then in other cultures, and we see this in business as well, a very hierarchical, concentrated power structure where the decisions ultimately are taken by only a few. Again, if you just look at the relating and the regulating, those differences can be enormous if you are not aware of those from a leadership point of view. And then finally, the reasoning, and this is probably the most difficult one because we don't often realize until we're exposed to different worldviews how our background, our upbringing, and our education has in fact influenced the way that we think. So there are certain cultures on the left-hand side here that are quite linear. And you see that in the presentation style, in the way that things are put across. My presentation today reflects some of my own cultural bias in the fact that it's very linear, 4 or 5 or 6 points, and we move from point 1 to point 2 to point 3. It's very based on facts, and in the limited amount of time that I've had, I'm trying to keep it simple. But I'm conscious that in many cultures, this would be flying in the face of reason because they want to understand not just the linear process but the circular process of how did you get to your points. There's not any good just presenting the facts, but what was the theory behind the facts? Who were the thought leaders that you used to come up with this particular conclusions? And so they tend towards the complex. And so looking at these 9 cultural orientations based on the 3 dimensions of relating, regulating, and reasoning, you're then able to plot out, if you like, some form of a grid where if you looked at each of these blocks, you might find in fact that maybe for task, you are somewhere here where my cursor is. You might find that for implicit or explicit, you're somewhere here, and so on. And what you eventually end up with is a profile, and I'm showing 2 profiles in this slide. The one in blue represents a particular individual, and the one in the orange squares represents a different individual. And by doing the comparison and the mapping of their cultural profile, I'm then able to see where the particular possible areas of tension might be. So if we look at these 2 profiles and we say that the blue represents party A and the orange represents party B, the squares I'm referring to now, we can see that they are both more relationship focused, so that would suggest that they will have some commonality there. But blue is much more explicit than implicit. What does that mean? Blue is going to say what he or she thinks. They're going to wear their heart on their sleeves. They're going to be very low context in their communication. Whereas orange is much more implicit. You have to read between the lines. They don't necessarily say what they mean. They infer, they imply. Now that can be disastrous for cross-cultural communication because one leader who's very explicit reading a communication or receiving a communication from the implicit leader may not pick up on the nuances. If you look at the differences between blue and orange in terms of individual and the group, you will see that blue is far more individualistic, far more focused on making decisions on her own or on his own, whereas orange wants to defer. They want to get the collective involved. I think if you look at time, you can see there would be a big difference there. where blue is much more punctual, much more focused on deadlines, much more focused on the importance of hitting all of the major milestones of the project, whereas orange has a very different priority. This is not to say that orange doesn't see an outcome as important, but maybe approaches the outcome and the deadlines in a much more fluid way. Orange is also much more comfortable with a more concentrated decision-making process. So they want to defer to a manager or a leader who will take the final decision. It's not open for discussion, and it's left, power is limited to a few individuals in the organization. Whereas blue, much more shared, much more democratic, much more consensual. This could frustrate orange because orange may feel that we need to move on, we need to make a decision and go for it. Whereas blue may feel I need to confer, I need to get consensus, I need to ask for further input. And then you can see from a reasoning point of view, again, the major difference here would be on the fact that blue wants to focus on the facts, whereas orange wants to understand the thought processes and the complexity behind that. So the great thing about this tool is not only are you able to map your cultural profile, but you're also then able to compare that to others in your organization, others from your particular ethnic group, and if you were traveling, you would then use this cultural profile as some form of background or basis for preparation when you're moving into another territory. I think of times when I've traveled from South Africa into the UK or into America or into Europe or into the Middle East or even into the Far East. I've relied heavily on a tool like this to understand, first of all, what are my cultural tendencies. Those have been shaped by my background, my education, and my thinking, and then using the cultural profile to understand something of the nuances of the particular audience that I may well be working with. Here's one example of why this is important. I've just taken one extract on communication. And what you can see here, based on significant research that's been done in geographical territories around the world, how if we look at the explicit and implicit profile, you will see on the left-hand side nation states that are far more explicit in the way that they communicate, and as I move to the right, cultures that tend to be far more implicit, and there's plenty of evidence for this kind of research. And so this would have implications, say, for somebody coming from a very strong German culture engaging, if I take the extreme, with somebody from a Japanese culture and vice versa. And if you're aware of this diversity, and if you're aware of these polarities, it's going to make you that much more effective in the way that you communicate. I think it is important, though, just to put in one rider, and that is that we need to recognize that we come back to what we said earlier, we're talking about individuals. So we want to recognize that there will be some overlap between the norms in culture A and the norms in culture B, and very often we will find that not all people from a particular culture represent that culture. So although I may have grown up in the UK and lived in South Africa and studied in America, I would still have elements of my cultural profile that may not necessarily reflect my dominant cultural background. And I think that's important, and that comes back to what we said earlier about avoiding the stereotypes and the fixed worldview, and recognizing that although we do have tendencies, we are ultimately dealing with individuals. So the last thing that I want to talk about then is the country navigator. This is a tool that we use based on the TMA World Profiles to recognize, first of all, the key factors that contribute to cross-cultural competence. Secondly, it enables us to apply a model of culture to analyzing the impact of cultural differences on core business activities. And thirdly, it means that we can identify strategies and practices for managing cross-cultural communication and working challenges. And I think back to some of the work that's been done by my colleagues, Dr. David Livermore or Professor Andy Minsky. Dr. Livermore's book was on cultural intelligence difference, and Andy Minsky's book is on global dexterity. But they both make the point that you need to understand, first of all, your motivation to develop cultural intelligence. You need to develop the knowledge of how your own culture may be different to those around you. Thirdly, you need to have some kind of strategy, what they call a metacognition, an ability to address any differences and make sense of those differences when you see them by suspending your own judgment. And then thirdly, adapting, and I think that's the key thing, being willing to adapt to new situations. So the Country Navigator is a tool that we use. It has, and I have some examples here of situations where you can compare your own profile to those of your work group or your colleagues. You can use it to understand different cultural approaches within your project. So here you can see that in the flight maps that we use, we've got some geographical background, we've got information on population, on time zones, on mindsets. We call these flight packs, and we give our attendees 12 months unlimited access to a tool like this. I think what's also important then is to recognize the data behind this. We've got 87 country and cultural profiles. You're able to compare your profile with up to 5 countries or colleagues. And we've got 500,000 people who've completed their profiles. All of this comes with thousands of e-learning resources. These are interactive and bite-sized. It's supported by podcasts and videos and quizzes. And it's structured learning paths for self-study, and it can be country-specific. So what you're seeing here are some downloadable resources that enable you to interact and tap into the knowledge of subject matter experts and use this web-based tool to give you really valuable insight into how to successfully work and interact with people from different cultures. I'm coming in for a landing, and so at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Ali. We finished probably about 6 or 7 minutes early, Ali, but I thought we might want to take time for questions. So let me do that now and ask if there's anything that anybody wanted to discuss.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew. Folks, now if you have any questions, you could put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console. So if you click on it, I should give you an opportunity to speak to speaker. Let me go straight. I believe there is a hand raised. So let me try to see. We have Brother Ahmed Milibari. Brother, could you please introduce yourself and ask the question?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Sir, we can hear you.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Yes. I am at the University of Nottingham in the Language Center. I've been away from my hometown, Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, since I was 22. I'm almost 50 now. I finished a doctorate degree about 10 years ago in stylistics, but with the University of Nottingham, I established myself as the first teacher of Arabic language and culture. Now, I teach the culture of the language and the culture of the people, you know, and quite interestingly, because I place myself in culture A/B, and I see myself leaning towards culture B in so many aspects, but then I go back to my roots and I find things related to factors such as punctuality, for example. Now, being a Meccan folk, I think about the 5 daily prayers and how much impact they should have on our daily activities and daily lives. And I think that's part of cultural A, but it's not practiced as culture A. How do we go about such areas where certain stereotypes or certain practices don't map across very clearly as you have given models? And thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it's a complex question and probably something that we would need more time to explore. But I think, Ali, if I understand the question, it's what do I do when I'm bridging two cultures and there are elements or practices within my, let's say, my culture of origin that don't necessarily translate into into the second culture. Did you understand the question in the same way, Ali?
Yes, agreed. I think it's a bridging, it's a mapping that the brother is asking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, Brenda, there's two things here. I think, first of all, I've got to work hard to develop my cognition around where are the differences, either perceived or otherwise, between these two cultures. I think, secondly, I've got to make sense of where those differences are. And I have to be willing to suspend judgment when I see that maybe the second culture doesn't practice things that I might hold dear. I don't think, and I want to underline this point, and I think all of the researchers around this would agree, that cultural intelligence doesn't mean that you do not continue to be who you are and that you don't give reflection to who you are based on your culture of origin. I think the challenge comes in how willing, if we think about this as degrees, so am I wanting to assimilate totally into a new culture and give up my identity from the first? I don't think that's what we're saying. I think all that we're saying is that in the global world, there is going to be ongoing greater interaction between cultures. There will be a negotiation always between cultures as to what are we prepared to surrender possibly in terms of priority to another culture. But I think if we come back to the values and the beliefs, then cultural intelligence also says these are things that are important to me and I hold on to those, but I recognize that they have to be expressed in a way that shows sensitivity to people from a second culture who may not always understand what's driving that behavior. So I think it's about an ongoing conversation. I think it's about dialogue, and I think it's about recognizing that the more we can have a meeting of the minds around these things, the more effective we will be. I know, Brenda, that I've got nowhere near answering the complexity of that question, but I hope that helps.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope, Brother Ahmed, that do you have any supplementary question or comment, Brother Ahmed, to make, or we can move to the caller then?
Yes, I appreciate the response, which I think has touched upon main points of the complex question that I have posed. My only follow-up point is, when a Muslim with 5 daily activities that provide punctuality does not comply with this punctuality factor, do I go with the common practice in regards to that factor, or do I emphasize the point that, we need to go back to the original punctuality part of our culture? Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, because what you're asking is very practical. I think it's about creating understanding. I think it's about talking to people from the second culture that we referred to enable them to understand why you need to do what you do, for them to understand something of the belief system and the value, because if they understand that, then very often it means, if we go back to our iceberg, that they're not just interpreting it in terms of what they see, but they start to understand what's driving that behavior. And so I think it's really important to work hard, particularly when in the example you give there is often such a disparity between what you want to do and what you're able to give expression to. There is that need to have ongoing conversation with people to help them understand why this is a priority for you. And again, we can see that there are no single answers. This is complex, but it's about having the ability to engage with people, to share with them the importance of not just looking at what they see in terms of the observed practice or the behavior, but helping them understand what is driving that in terms of fundamental beliefs, and sharing those beliefs, because the more that I understand you and where you come from, the more it gives me understanding and empathy as to why you express yourself in a particular way. And I think, given the example that you've just shared, it's topical, and it's certainly something that I think is center stage right now. So there's no doubt that this is something that we all need to be considering. Ali?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Brother Ahmed, for very interesting questions. So let me move to another caller, our regular caller, Dr. Muhammad Rishad. Doctor, could you please once again introduce and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Andrew, for a great presentation. And in talking in respect to the cultural orientation, you talked about the reasoning. And the reasoning will be talking about the, I assume, talking about the critical thinking, and maybe the output may be something innovation or something coming up for. So in terms of culture, diversity brings innovation and more thought process, and innovative things keeps coming up. So Dr. Andrew, with your experience, we have a culture of USA, Canada, or maybe UK, India, where there's like more, they're open to diversity of different cultures working for in perspective of the innovation. But on the other hand, there are countries where it's less of diversity. Diversity in terms of that degree is like countries like Japan, or maybe Sweden, Norway, Finland, or maybe China. So seeing the two polarization of diversity, so can you throw some of your experience in that respect?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I think that what you make is a very interesting point, that we are seeing almost two different approaches to how we enter, the global market. The one is to say we have a dominant culture. This is what we want to hold intact. We're going to celebrate this, and we're going to take this to market, and people will need to just embrace how we do things, even if it's completely different to the context with which we want to work. And then you also referred to this first approach where there is an intentional strategy to represent diversity in my employee makeup, in my leadership, in the way that I do things. And I think both of them have their place. But it does seem from the research that the companies that are really making successful inroads in being able to demonstrate greater understanding and bridge the cultural divide are those that are taking time to be more representative in the way that they go about doing their business. Now, that's not true completely. If we think about, for example, the entree of many Chinese companies into different parts of the world, what you will see is that because of the size of their workforce and because of the size of their staff complement, they're able to bring a lot of their labor force with them, and then they set up, in many cases, almost enclaves within a particular new geography where they retain almost everything. I'm aware of many companies where people will enter a new territory and never learn the local language and have no need to learn the local language because they're able to be self-sufficient, in and of themselves. So I think it would be incorrect, Dr. Mohammed, to say that the one, is better than the other. I would say, though, that I think the companies that are looking to be more diverse in their makeup are probably going to be more effective in the long term simply because of the sustainability of that particular practice. But I think the jury is still out as to which approach ultimately is going to win. I mean, we can see that if we certainly look at the expansion of the Eastern Territories, in many cases, they would simply go in with a single strategy that doesn't necessarily see any need to embrace this diversity in the way that we've spoken about.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Andrew, for your insight, and thanks, Ali, for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Brother Mohsen Lo. The question is, how much intentions play part in CQ?
Ali, can you just repeat the question? Your question started out well on the audio, and then I lost you.
Okay, the question is, sir, let me repeat. Is it how much intentions play part in CQ, culture quotient?
Oh, intentions are absolutely critical. So if you think about a lot of the research that's been done on cultural intelligence, and I'm assuming that by intention we mean will, we mean motivation. If that is what's being referred to in the question, then I would say it's critical. If I don't intentionally want to learn about other people, if I don't intentionally want to understand what is going on around me, if I don't intentionally want to suspend judgment, then I'm going to find myself struggling in terms of developing my cultural intelligence. So one of the things that cultural intelligence does is it says you have to begin by thinking about what is my level of interest and confidence in functioning effectively in culturally diverse settings. And this often gets overlooked. So if you don't have the intention or the drive to take on those challenges and to embrace the multicultural situation, then I think there's little evidence that you will be successful. So if I've understood the question correctly, I would say in a short answer, intentions, and the intentions in cultural intelligence are critical, because without those you don't have the motivation or the drive to develop your cultural intelligence in the first place.
Well, thank you very much. And we have one last question from Mr. Mark Stora. The question is, what is the average dollar value to CQ? What are the tangible benefits?
Mark, thank you for that question. And it would be incorrect for me to try and throw a number out. I'm sure that that research is there. But all I will say is this, that there is a lot of evidence put out by researchers like, I'm thinking of Zenger and Folkman and others based in the States, who've looked at the relationship between leadership and profitability. And in thinking about those numbers, part of that leadership development has to do with cultural intelligence. So we know, and I can't give you the dollar number, but we know that leadership impacts on employee engagement, it impacts on retention, it impacts on staff motivation. Those are internal drivers. And externally, it impacts on customer satisfaction, it impacts on customer retention, and it impacts on market share. Again, I don't have the dollar number, Ali, but I know that if we argue that cultural intelligence is one of the competencies of an effective leader, then there's plenty of evidence to show the correlation between leadership and profitability.
Okay, thank you very much. That really brings towards the end of the webinar. And Dr. Andrew, any concluding remarks that you have before we dismiss that?
Well, maybe just to say, Ali, if I can just get to the slide, that if people have particular questions that they want to pose, my email address is on the screen now. There's also a website, and if they would like more detail about the tools that we've spoken about or more specific information on cultural intelligence, we'd be really happy to take those. I think this is an ongoing debate. I think that we are still learning so much about how to develop cultural intelligence. But what I've tried to do today is to show that if leaders are willing to suspend judgment and to develop their capability to function effectively in a variety of cultural contexts, that they develop the drive, they develop the knowledge, they develop the strategy, and they are willing to adapt, this is going to bode well for them in their leadership, it's going to bode well for their organizations, and it's going to bode well for them as they work in what we now refer to as the borderless workplace. Ali, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you and with your participants today.
No, sir. Thank you very much. I really wanted to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for the time you have given us and for a very, very interesting presentation, a very unique topic indeed. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. You may download the soft copy of the presentation from the MILE community. The link has already been pasted in the chat box. The recorded version will be available on the same platform in the next couple of days. So please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org. And also please do not forget to visit palm.mile.org, which is a program for advanced leadership and management. PALM 7 scheduled to commence in the month of April 2020.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.